Prologue. New Orleans, 1931. Enid looked into the bathroom mirror and saw only sadness and unease. The last few days had aged her, draining away youth and hope in equal measure. She looked down the hallway toward her son's bedroom. Without going in, she knew he lay motionless on his bed. He hadn't moved in hours, which only added to Enid's feeling of dread. She walked in and looked down at his pale body. He looked like a photograph, not yet fully developed, or worse, a picture fading right before her eyes. Perspiration poured from the young boy, even as a gentle fall breeze drifted through the open bedroom window. The breeze moved slowly through the room with a seemingly casual indifference. It had little effect in cooling the young boy down. He had gotten sick about a week ago, and now the fever had a hold of him, but good. It gripped him tightly, like a sinister boa constrictor squeezing the life right out of him, drip by vital drip. Enid was near panic, and at a loss where to turn or what to do. She had taken him into town a few days ago, but the doctor there had offered little help. He said that kids often got sick and offered advice that seemed wholly insufficient, it appeared to Enid. He told her to simply keep him cool and give him some aspirin to help with the fever. He might as well have suggested Enid wave a magic wand over her son and recite some ancient incantation for all the good his advice would do. Her son was really sick, and aspirin wasn't going to cut it. Even Enid knew that much. To make matters worse, Enid's husband Franklin was out of town with the oil company where he worked as a rigger. So in the end, she was alone with a sick child whose fever refused to abate, and she was running out of options and patience simultaneously. She picked the young boy up. His little 4-year-old body seemed as light as a feather in her arms. He had lost a lot of weight in the last week, way too much, in fact. Concern gnawed at Enid, leaving her with a sad and anxious feeling in the pit of her stomach. She felt she had to do something, so she gathered her young son up in her arms and took him out to the back porch, hoping the exposure to the cool night air might help. He cried softly in her arms, and she too began to cry, tears falling from her cheeks and rolling down on her cotton nightgown. She sat down on the rocking chair on the back porch and cradled her son. She rocked back and forth slowly. The motion soothed her nerves a bit and seemed to put the boy into a light sleep. He now lay motionless in her arms. Short, shallow breaths fought their way from his lungs to his tiny mouth. Yet, he lay quietly in her lap, and Enid thanked the gods for small favors. She sat there for some time, gently rocking back and forth. As she rocked, her mind began to drift, and a haze seemed to envelop her senses. It wrapped around her mind like a dense fog. She experienced a moment of disorientation, and then, before she realized it, she was up and walking toward the marsh that lay beyond their house. She held her son close to her chest as she walked into the bayou. She was being drawn away from her house, but by what, she did not know. In fact, she wasn't sure why she had left the house. She had just done it without any conscious thought. She could sense something back in her mind pushing her, nudging her onward, and it disturbed her. Yet she seemed unable to prevent herself from moving farther into the marsh. Reflexively, she held onto her son more tightly with each and every step she took. As she neared the swamp, she could perceive a low humming sound coming from the marsh. It pulled her towards it, and in a few minutes she found herself now ankle-deep in the muck and mire. Then she paused and stood motionless, waiting and listening. Standing there, she could discern the creatures of the swamp as they went about their nightly business. They seemed to pay scant notice to her and her son. The frogs croaked in their strange, throaty language. The crickets chirped their incessant song. And off in the distance, she heard the wail of a loon. Although loons were not common in Louisiana, she was sure that was what it had been. She stood there, just listening, and slowly her mind became muddled. Her thoughts became cloudy and indistinct. She knew where she was, but not why, and that fact sent a shiver of fear throughout her body. She was simply there, Her actions had been driven by something external and completely alien. She froze for some time, the brackish water lapping up against her calves. Then the fog around her deepened, and she lost touch with even the most basic thoughts and emotions. She laid her son down in the marsh beside a grove of mangrove trees and sat down beside him. She stared down at him, then up at the trees. The trees seemed to hum louder, and her eyes began to grow heavy. And then they closed completely, as if on their own accord. Then she simply fainted dead away. She awoke to her son pulling gently on her nightgown, saying, "Mommy," over and over again. How long had she been unconscious? She had no idea, but it must have been some time because she could see that dawn was approaching. She shook her head and the fog of sleep began to slip from her. Slowly, she gained clarity and perspective. The morning sun was evaporating the fog that had clouded her mind the night before. She then looked down at her son, Justin, with a mother's concern and worry. What had she done to her sick child? Then she looked more closely at him, and to her amazement, he looked better. Much better, in fact. His eyes were clear and there was color in his cheeks. She scrambled to her feet, picking her son up in the process. He felt more substantial in her arms than he had the night before. This was not normal, she knew that. But could she really question the fact that her son now appeared healthy and normal? She wouldn't, and if her son continued to get better, she would never mention this night to anyone. No, she thought to herself, she would keep the night's surreal and disturbing events a dark secret in her heart. As she thought about that promise, dawn crept across the sky. With the silent patience of a loving grandfather, the sun brought warmth to the new day, and she took comfort in that feeling. She looked from the sky to the mangrove trees that stood around them. They rose from the ground like sentinels, standing there watching her and her son. Drifting in the air was that low hum she remembered hearing last night. It was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was as if the hum was in the air, but something deep in Enid's soul knew that the trees were the source of the sound. The whole situation seemed unnatural to Enid, and her mind simply wanted to shut it all out. She turned and hurried away from this place back to her home and to things she understood and that offered comfort in their normalcy. Over the next week, her son did indeed grow stronger, and for this, Enid was eternally grateful. But she would never again walk down to the mangrove trees that lay by the water's edge. No, she would definitely never go back there again.